Hello everyone, welcome to yet another day in this The Clown Decade, the decade where things are only going to get worse before they get better. And if you would like to keep up with all things Clown Decade, please do subscribe to the channel and of course become a member. And today I am going to be directly addressing the type of people, both left-wing and right-wing, who effectively think that Reform are in on the whole bubble with the mainstream media, Tories and Labour, which, yes, while they've had quite a few defections, especially from the Tories, I don't think it's quite sane to say that they have an in or are part of the mainstream media agenda. The main reason I am saying this is because I actually watch the mainstream, more specifically Times Radio Politics, which has an awful lot of researchers on, people from all over the mainstream on, both parties on, and I actually listen to what they have to say, and this is something I think is missing from an awful lot of people's media diets, because at the end of the day, these people are pretty much still the enemy, at the very least politically. And if you don't know what your enemies are saying or what they're doing, you're not going to have a good time and you're not going to win. Luckily, Reform seem to actually be paying attention to all that sort of thing, which does give me hope, but an awful lot of alternative media, especially on the right wing these days, not doing a very good job of that. They're making vapid assumptions, saying things that aren't quite right, and I'm making this video partly in response to that. But anyway, back to Times Radio Politics. A great example of what I mean by Reform clearly aren't in the in here is that Hugo Rifkind, or Kin, sorry, runs a podcast for them called How to Win an Election. And every week he will get guests on, some more regular than others, but only from Labour, Tories, and then another Times columnist usually. No one from Reform goes there, and as you can tell from the title of this, Nigel Farage's brilliance echoes Boris Johnson. A lot of the time, for obvious reasons, because they're talking about how to win elections, Reform are brought up all the time. Is there any insider from Reform on this? No. Have they invited anyone on? I have no idea. But just to make it clear from this particular video, they spent the first 20 minutes reminiscing, all these people, about times that they were effectively on the inside of the Westminster bubble, getting trapped in panic rooms in the Chequers, meeting up with prime ministers and other ministers all the time, reminiscing about things like that. Who from Reform can really say that? Probably Lee Anderson, maybe Nigel Farage, because obviously he's friends with some of the right-wing Tories, as you'd expect. But, and this is even brought up in the comments, which I don't want to dwell on too much, but effectively, you have a podcast all about politics and what the strategy is to win, and all the time they are just speculating on Reform, and the reason for that is because, frankly, they don't want Reform in their bubble. Reform is, to all of these people, on the outside. And to get properly into this, we are going to be looking at an interview that Times Radio conducted with Richard Tice just yesterday about the whole victory over in Epping, and just listen to the way this interview goes.
Other councils presumably are going to do the same, so the whole policy is now in question, as it appears the public attitude is to housing migrants in the UK is changing.
I mean, even here already, before they've even introduced Richard Tice, they're explaining, oh well, Epping won, people seem to have changed their mind about housing asylum seekers here. No, people's opinions haven't largely changed over the last 5 years in Normiverse, let's say. In the mainstream, that's probably true, and that's probably what he's reflecting here as we will go through. But when it came to the general public, hotels were always a disaster. That's why it became absolutely massive news back in 2020 when, Nigel Farage of all people was going into hotels inquiring about the illegal migrants that are being put up there. And then it was in the news constantly. Why are the Tories constantly putting them in there? That doesn't make sense. So the attitude hasn't changed. It's just now we know the political route to go down to actually stop it happening.
I want to ask you about this council action, Richard Tice. Are Reform-led councils going to pursue the same action? Will, in the councils you control, 10 of them, will you be objecting legally to asylum hotels within those councils?
Yes, absolutely. Our council leaders will be instructing legal departments to pursue all legal avenues after this ruling.
So Reform are quite clearly sticking their flag in the we don't want them in hotels, well, side of the fence, I suppose, which has obviously always been their position.
Do you think the precedent would actually also exist for things other than hotels, a block of flats or a university accommodation where effectively asylum seekers have been concentrated in that area? Do you think that that would also offer grounds to pursue this?
Yes, and we've already been looking at HMOs that have been wrongly, incorrectly used under current planning laws.
And this was actually something that I know has been mentioned by Zia Yusuf in the past as well. They're trying to go down legal avenues to effectively get rid of the problem of illegal migrants being housed everywhere where they shouldn't be, when they should obviously be deported. I mean, at the moment, like most interviews, this is starting out in quite a regular fashion. They're giving away the perspective of, oh, I think that the public are changing their mood on this, when the public mood was always pretty much against don't let people in here who shouldn't be here. But obviously Reform are going a hard line on this and are expanding where their focus is going to be beyond hotels, which is very good to hear. So Tice then goes into how effectively the processing needs to be done much quicker, and frankly they should all be given a red rubber stamp as default because they came in illegally. Let's see what the interviewer has to say about that.
Some of the asylum seekers, though, will have their asylum granted. And so the question is, while that process is being looked at, I mean, simply coming here without a visa doesn't mean their asylum can't eventually be granted, does it? So they will need...
Well, it does actually, because they've come here illegally. They've broken the law. They are a criminal. It is as simple as that. They have come from a safe country under the UN 51 Convention.
That is true, by the way. Your asylum claim can't actually be rejected if you break a law when in the country, and, well, by measure of us having border laws, at least in theory, they have broken the law and therefore cannot be it can be rejected from an asylum claim. And this is probably the issue with the ECHR and Human Rights Act. We have a lot of laws that are actually in conflict because our Parliament has a problem in that it ends up making a bunch of laws. Usually the intentions are not to do with each law, but then they get so wound up and there's so many lawyers making arguments using different laws that go against each other, you end up having a Great Repeal Act, which we have actually had before, and I can see us having again.
And the question is, will that hold up legally, which is what I suppose while the government is saying they're pursuing it, and we're still testing the ground on that.
This is where I think Tice is quite underrated as a Reform MP, to be quite honest with you. He is quite good at remembering the main points against a lot of these predictable arguments. And he's actually quite good at backing them off into corners, because I don't think that's a well-known part of the Refugee Convention. I certainly don't think that this Times interviewer will have heard of that before, and they don't really know how to answer it, so it's just, oh god, move on. I guess the Labour government are looking into that, which I doubt, by the way. Anyway, Tice then goes into a large defence of the protests that have been going on recently, saying they're great, they are almost entirely peaceful, it's all singing, dancing, waving of British and English flags, which we all love to see, and it's had an actual effect by closing the Epping Hotel, but obviously the inevitable has to be brought up.
I mean, sometimes they take a darker turn, you'll be aware of that. Sometimes people join those protests who act improperly, who require police intervention, who act in a way that causes its own disquiet.
And those are generally people from the hard left, the Socialist Workers' Party.
They're not only that. Both sides. There's clearly been far-right problems as well. And you would condemn, I presume, Richard Tice, I presume you would condemn far-right people as well as you would condemn far-left people.
I condemn all violent, non-peaceful protests. But the truth is, and I know it's difficult for many in the mainstream media, that the majority of the unpleasantness has arisen when the likes of Antifa and the Socialist Worker lot have arrived and started to be pretty unpleasant, and that's where problems emerge. That's the harsh reality of the situation.
And it's pretty much only Reform saying this part. Yeah, from all my coverage of it as well, when I have seen these protests going on, the organised counter-protests by Stand Up to Racism, Socialist Worker Party, Antifa obviously turn up. They tend to have the masks on and all that, which the police are happy to escort, by the way, let's not forget that. It's Reform saying that. You get nothing about that from the Tories. Obviously you don't get anything from it from Labour, and the mainstream media are trying to cover it all the time, trying to say, oh, there are far-right people there too, which, by the way, yeah, I do agree. It hypes them up, it gives them an excuse to start attacking the police, and they start doing it, and the attempt of that is to try and obviously delegitimise the protests. And we saw Tory councillors doing this too. Oh, the Reform councillor we have in Epping, he stood side by side with far-righties. They stopped saying that instantly when, obviously, I nearly said Suella Braverman, I don't think she turned up at Epping, but Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch started turning up. Because the smear, frankly, doesn't work particularly well when, sure, Homeland are organising some of the protests, But when it's all then pink ladies, mums of Epping, what have you, when it's all them having the majority of the organisation for these Epping protests, yeah, what ends up happening is that those, oh, it's the far right accusations don't tend to work. And from what I've seen as well, these women, they leave the area once it gets all messy because they want to differentiate themselves from that. Anyway, once again, do the interviewers have an answer to that? No, so they quickly move on.
Deportation, immediate deportation back to another country is not possible. So there is a process that needs to take place where asylum seekers need to be housed. If they can't be housed in concentrated areas, where should they be housed?
Well, let's just touch on where people can be deported to. It's interesting that Germany, for example, is deporting people who've arrived illegally in Germany back to places like Afghanistan. So yes, we can send people back to countries that our establishment have said we can't. That needs to start immediately.
Once again, bringing up other countries. Oh, look, they can do it. Clearly it's possible. Clearly the ECHR shouldn't be getting in the way of this.
But whilst that is going on and you process people much faster, yes, people should be housed in detention camps, in tents, in former or disused military bases. That's what happens elsewhere.
Once again, using examples of elsewhere. They can do it, why can't we? Are we that unique in our human rights laws? And if we are, get rid of them. That was literally in the Reform manifesto.
Do you think that British people, I'm interested, this is a genuine question, I'm not trying to score a point, because I'm actually interested in whether the nation's mood is shifting on this. Do you think the British nation would be happy to see asylum seekers being effectively forcibly detained, put in camps, put in detention centres, put in tents in areas where they can't move freely?
Yes.
Do you think Britain is actually happy to see that?
Yes, I think the fury, the rage, the anger across the country is something that I've never experienced in my 60 years of life.
It's almost the shock and disbelief from the interviewer. Do you really think that the anger's that bad? Do you think they'll be happy with them being put in tents and deported straight away? Yes. Pretty much a Chad yes. This has been said by Reform basically since their inception, for goodness sake. Anyway, they move on to more economic stories after that. The interviewer wasn't actually particularly bad there, letting Richard Tice answer the question, not particularly interrupting. It's a good interview, really. But it's just to give you a taste of when you have a good interviewer. Obviously, they don't get mad or anything like that. They let him talk. But you can tell from the way these questions are being asked and the assumptions that are being made that they are still very much in a bubble that Reform are outside of, and Reform have to keep telling them, oh, by the way, the British people are obviously way to the right of this. That's who we're representing. And that puts them at odds with this bubble that effectively wants to keep the status quo largely going, and the way they think they're going to have to do that is effectively, oh, make it look like we're deporting a load of people at the same time. We're going to have to find somewhere to cut spending, and we can't even do that with this current Labour Party, so they're a bit screwed. But I really wanted to go into another Times radio discussion being had by the likes of Dominic Sandbrook, Edwina Currie, and the other two journalists that we were just listening to. Edwina Currie obviously being an ex-Tory minister, and Dominic Sandbrook being more a centre-right normie who, as you will watch, is quite sceptical of Reform. Anyway, I'll show you what I mean within this discussion, which again is being had about Reform, with absolutely no one supporting Reform being present. This is an average day in the Times radio studio. Anyway, they're talking largely about the Epping hotel issue yet again, and we're just going to pick bits and pieces out that make my point.
I think we're approaching it from the wrong angle. So the angle is like, oh, these people are here. Gosh, now we have to find somewhere to put them. Actually, Danny Finkelstein has a really good column on this in the Times this morning, that the common sense answer to this is actually you don't get into this mess in the first place. So I think for the last 20 years or so, politicians have been arguing about this and saying clearly the number is too great and we need to reduce it. But then they say, oh, well, the current system, the rules make it very difficult to reduce it. As Danny says in the Times, I actually think if the rules make it impossible to change it, then you change the rules.
Which is the funniest part of all of this. This is what Nigel Farage, Richard Tice, hell, even Rupert Lowe, what all the Reform and ex-Reform MPs have been saying. change the rules. It's ridiculous that we are bound by these rules that don't put our own people's interests first. Especially when the rules, as they mentioned back in Blair's day, was you could deport a load of people. Obama could deport a load of people. And then the rules changed with the international order, whatever you want to call it, where deporting people was seen as, well, evil, because an awful lot of people on the left don't believe in borders. Well, that's not gone particularly well for the past decade or so. And so, effectively now with Danny Finkelstein, again ex-Tory, now effectively saying maybe our common assumptions have been wrong for some time. Again, this is all a reaction to Reform absolutely beating everyone in the polls. Hell, one came out today putting them 15 points ahead of Labour, who are in second place. And this is what I'm trying to get people to understand. The answer here isn't, oh, we need Reforming to fix this. The answer is, oh my god, Reform are making us all look like fools. We now need a very robust plan to try and effectively undermine them. That is effectively what the Tory plan is at the moment, because Labour aren't going to do any of this. Labour are going to lose by a landslide next election, whether that's to Reform or anyone else. The only people they've got really on side are dedicated union men and public sector workers. So this isn't a conversation about how do we get the Reform people on board. It is very much more a how do we undermine Reform and make them not a threat anymore. That's what all these conversations are about, because as I have to keep telling people, Reform are quite clearly on the outside. Just because they don't let the most shutting out people on the planet into the party doesn't mean that they aren't shutting out against the mainstream media, as we just saw Richard Tice doing.
And, you wouldn't start from here, in other words. As for where you put all these people, I mean, who knows? That's the problem, isn't it? It's that actually you can come up with all these sort of random solutions. Oh, we'll put them in a disused military base. But a disused military base doesn't necessarily have, does it even have the facilities to house such people? Does it have the staff? Does it have the sanitation or whatever?
Let's be real. Hotels may have the sanitation, I'll give him that, but they had to fire a load of people and hire in contractors to look after their teeth, look after their health, have security there, cook the meals there as well. It's not really an argument to say, oh, well, these things aren't ready right now, therefore they can't be. Great quick story on Accuracy International, which is a firearms manufacturer. They originated as just 3 guys in a shed making a decent sniper rifle that they then got a contract with the MOD because they won a competition for. And they had to send requisition officers to them to basically make sure they weren't just 3 guys in a shed. So on the week they had that, they hired out an old car shop, put a load of their sniper rifles around in different stages of being put together. Obviously the 3 of them were there to meet the requisition. They said, let's go for lunch. And the officers were like, where are the people that work on this? And they just said, oh, they're all on lunch. The officers were happy with that answer, gave them the contract, and then obviously they had to pretty much in a couple of weeks have a whole operation going. And they did it, and now they are a multinational company making some of the best sniper rifles in the world. You can really turn these things around overnight, so saying these things aren't ready now is ridiculous, especially when if we go to an example closer to home, somehow all these councils managed to get everything they need to together for these hotels ready in what feels like weeks. Hell, Canary Wharf, it was rumoured that was going to house asylum seekers. Obviously they said, oh no, totally not happening. And then in 2 days it was turned around and ready with security and new staff, making food and whatever for everyone to, be housed there quite happily. Obviously you can turn an army base, especially with the army's help, into a place to put these people while we get ready to deport them. And the mainstream are still not quite to the point of understanding that, as we are seeing from this conversation, whereas Reform are way ahead on it. Again.
So I don't have an answer. I don't think anybody has an answer. And that's another, it's just another example of why the current system is broken.
This is another common tactic. Oh, nobody has an answer. Whereas Reform are, again, outside the bubble, shouting in, saying, there's a pretty obvious answer. Get out the ECHR, get out the Human Rights Act, procure a hell of a load of deportation flights. Hell, we paid Rwanda a whole load of money and people are sending them there. We can do that too if you need a third country. And then bing bang bong. Yeah, there's going to be issues throughout that, as there always is with large projects like this. But name me one major government project that didn't have snags. Come on. Trump alone is proving that you can just solve immigration overnight. There is quite literally just a switch there. Okay, yeah, it comes with problems that you have to deal with. Of course, fixing every major problem does.
Oh, I think by the time we get to September the 12th, there'll be 15, 20 councils around the country that will have obtained similar injunctions, and some on rather better prepared grounds because they've been able to take note of what the judge said. It's a serious, serious crisis for the government, and it's all very well for Danny Finkelstein to say, well, you shouldn't have got here in the first place. Yes, the question is what we're going to do from here onwards.
It's another point to bring up here. Obviously, she's just been asked, well, what are your predictions now that Reform is saying they're going to go down this legal avenue? The Tories are saying they're going to do it too. And yeah, it's all very well and good, Danny Finkelstein saying, well, don't get yourself in this position in the first place. What's no one actually bringing up here? Guess who was saying that for years? Richard Tice, Nigel Farage, Lee Anderson as well to some degree, and he was in the Tories. Hell, right-wing Tories were saying this, for God's sake. And yet here we are with absolutely no credit given, which I don't expect anyway, don't get me wrong, and basically everyone uneasily moving towards saying, oh, maybe Nigel Farage was right, but they don't want to do it. And they don't want to do it because he's on the outside. The people on the outside of this whole clique, this whole bubble, have to be wrong in their mind, which is why they are effectively trying to convince themselves that they're coming to the same conclusions as Reform, independently of Reform, which obviously isn't true, because they are being eaten alive in the polls by Reform.
And what's going to happen very quickly, and it could happen in a matter of a couple of weeks if the government put their mind to it, would be to change the law and to think very hard about withdrawing from some of the human rights legislation and the convention. I have moved very much away from a liberal stance on this because the liberal stance just makes things worse, it seems, so that we can get to a stage where anybody who arrives illegally in this country can be held at the ports or at the airport, if that's how they're going to arrive, and sent home immediately. And that's going to mean a big investment in courts that can sit maybe even overnight and then can be sent home without challenge. And if that means we miss a few asylum seekers, then we are going to have to think very hard about how to deal with that.
Again, this is just basically saying the same thing Richard Tice was saying to these same interviewers, talking openly about how, well, obviously we need to be a lot less liberal with our immigration policy because everyone hates it and nobody voted for it. There's no appreciation of that, by the way. The mainstream still think that this was all voluntary and we tried this experiment with the consent of the nation. It's not true. We've always voted against more immigration, even when we had net immigration back in Thatcher's day.
Dominic, is that the inevitable next step, a sort of fundamental radical overhaul of our laws?
Yeah, I think it is, actually. I guess like Edwina, I sort of feel that instinctively that I would want to take a kind of liberal position and, it's nice to be kind and so on and so forth. But the context, and it's not just over the last few years, I'm talking about over the last 25 years or so.
The mainstream are moving. I know Edwina and Sambrook are pretty much centre-right, but quite clearly they are thinking, you used to have all these opinions, they're not working anymore. Why is that? All the protests, very well done protest, Reform as well. No one's bringing up Homeland, and Times love bringing up Homeland to try and obviously smear some of the protests as being far right. They're not even doing it here. What is on all of these people's minds at the moment is effectively, how do we save the Uniparty? What can we do to undermine Reform? I guess do what they want us to do anyway. Which is a step in the correct direction, obviously, but then the next question is, okay, are you actually going to stick with that, or is it going to be, release a pressure valve somewhere, and then we can carry on as it is? Much like what happened with Boris Johnson. Ironically enough, after what Boris Johnson did, and oversaw the most illegal migrants and most migrants ever, that's made it a lot harder to try and do that yet again.
I'm sure Edwina agrees with this. In the last few years, that the centre of gravity of public opinion has changed, that it's stopped being a kind of very noisy, raucous, perhaps slightly, there's always been a slight air of unpleasantness about anti-immigration sentiments. But I think it's become much more...
People are prepared to say now, we don't want them here. And you wouldn't have said that 5 years ago.
Important distinction here. UKIP were fine with that. They were on the outside. Reform were saying that even when they were the Brexit party. They were on the outside. What's actually changed here? What they are calling public attitude, they're calling, the SW1 bubble, the Westminster bubble, whatever you want to call it, they're calling it that attitude. Oh, we're getting people like Robert Jenrick who are more openly anti-migrant than maybe they were in 2014 when he was saying, oh, my ancestors came from abroad too, and that's just like many immigrants today. I just got on a boat earlier. What's the difference? Now he's very much closed the damn borders. Why is that? Trying to undermine reform. This is kind of panic stations for the mainstream, although they're kind of past the initial panic stage and are now, okay, seriously, what do we actually do about this? Consistently in the polls, they're way up. And then you still get interviews with Tice, Anderson, Farage, obviously, Youssef, Cunningham, Pochin, all these people that are bringing up and hammering home the same thing over and over again. Crime feels like it's absolutely everywhere and people don't feel safe. Immigration, causing a hell of a load of problems. Our answers? Well, obviously, deal with the criminals by having a hell of a lot more prisons, deal with the illegals and foreign criminals by deporting them. How do we do that? Oh, well, you can actually turn it around quite quickly, seeing that literally in America and other countries. And here we have two Tory supporters with Times journalists, who probably somewhere between Labour and Tory, I don't know, somewhere within that bubble, effectively trying to convince themselves, well, yeah, obviously we have to have those positions, but we don't want to sound like we're agreeing with them. Because they're on the outside.
We actually had Luke Chill on, actually, to your point, the More in Common guy, and he said people wanting to willing to have people in their community has been a 25-point shift in 2 years.
I mean, it's always the interesting thing with polling. I'm nowhere near the idea that polling is all fake and you shouldn't trust it. I think what this does show a hell of a lot more is, well, when you come to stated preferences, sometimes you will try and just go with what the mainstream is saying to effectively try and fit in, even if it is a secret survey and things like that. Just because you see it everywhere and don't really think about it. What I think this shows more is people thinking a lot more about it, and I mean the boomers I talk to, really. Almost every boomer I know, maybe with a few exceptions within my family, always saw Enoch Powell, and especially the speech he gave, as effectively prophetic. And effectively, yeah, he's bringing up all the right points. I mean, some of them obviously said, oh, maybe it was a bit racist, but again, they're quoting the parts of the speech that was quoting his constituents, not Powell himself, you get the idea. And so, really, nobody wants bad immigration, obviously. People don't want entire communities over that are going to change the face of the area that they live, and on top of that make it worse. If they're making it better, I think that's probably a little bit more acceptable, but it depends on the person, obviously. And these days, frankly, I think with the rise of reform, it's given people more of a confidence of, oh look, there's actually a chance to overturn all these morons talking to each other about how great immigration is, a la Fraser Nelson. In other words, I think what's really happening here is that these people are finally being given a voice, a proper voice that can be heard in Parliament, and as a sort of battering ram against this bubble that we are currently looking into. And they are finally finding mush and saying, right, keep pushing. This, finally, the issue we've been complaining about for half a century, is getting some serious scrutiny. Keep going. Anyway, Edwina is then asked how far down I'm not so much on the Liberal side of this anymore, do you really want to go? And, well, this was her reply to it.
Well, Dan Jarvis and Yvette Cooper and Keir Starmer can agonise about this all they like. But if they don't get this under control within a year or so, they can guarantee losing the election next general election, to Reform, who will probably end up with as big a majority as Labour have got now, at the rate we're going. And that will mean that everything will get torn up. All sorts of other freedoms will get torn up.
Oh, I hope so. It's going to be glorious. Because the freedoms we've had in place, Human Rights Act, Equality Act, ECHR, whatever, it's all the positive freedoms that we used to go to. It's not so much a, here are your rights where you are free from other people's actions, such as, say, you have a right not to be murdered or assaulted. Much more, you have a freedom not to feel uncomfortable with someone not particularly liking a particular part of your lifestyle or something like that.
I think this government has really got to pivot. It has to go away from being a bunch of human rights lawyers who earn their spares by keeping people in this country to being a bunch of hard-nosed cynics. And they have to take what actually happens and make it work. the way that the electorate want.
Again, this is actually why I watch a lot of Times radio politics, because an awful lot of the time it is literally just all these people from all over the mainstream, whether it's in media, whether it's politicians, effectively having a struggle session, saying to themselves, how the hell do we go to the reform position without legitimising them? That's effectively what's happening here. Edwina Currie's position, how do you save the Labour Party? Well, this would be my advice for them. Just copy reform. Because at the end of the day, Tories especially do not want reform to end up winning and doing well. If reform end up winning and doing well, that is the whole Tory network collapsing in on itself. It's already kind of happening now, to be honest. Something like 75% of the campaign managers in London alone just don't exist anymore because they can't afford it. There's rumours that they're going to have to change headquarters because they can't afford the rent. And it's like, this is one thing I agree with Peter Hitchens on. The only thing keeping up the Labour Party is the Tory Party and vice versa. If one collapses, the other does. We're seeing that in real time, by the way. And Sandbrook obviously has comments to add on to that.
And the question is, do you want, this current government to do it, or do you want an untried, untested reform government, many of whom have never held political posts before, who don't really know how politics works or how government works? Do you want them doing it? And I would say I'd rather somebody else did it, frankly.
Yeah, there you go. Again, just straight out of the horse's mouth, so to speak. No offence to Mr. Sandbrook, I do like his work. But this is the position of the mainstream media. Don't let reform anywhere near government. They are not part of the in-group. They are not part of our elite circles, if you want to put it that way. They make it very obvious. And it's what constantly legitimises, and will keep legitimising, Farage and Reform as being outsiders. I know a lot of the replies to this are just going to be, oh, well, obviously, isn't this just a big ploy? I'm sorry, I don't think that they could keep this up. I don't think everyone could be this in lockstep as this centralised and organised plan. Everyone just pretend you really don't want Farage in, even though he's one of us. Do you think that would happen, or do you think that they would just let Farage and Tice into the Tory party years ago, rather than kicking them out, not making Farage an honorary lord, things like that? Let's be real here. This is simply the madness of the elite crowds. That's all we're seeing here. Anyway, back to Sandbrook, and he's asked about getting rid of human rights law and how actually, well, some of them are actually quite useful because, well, they give us some human rights. Isn't it going to be a completely different country if you get rid of them?
Agreed. But that doesn't mean that you then say, well, we can never change, right? No. That things are set in stone. I mean, I don't know. I'm trying to think of an example of a country that temporarily. How about this? In the American Civil War, Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. Yeah. It can be done, and you don't then become the Third Reich. It's
part of the reason I really like Dominic Sandbrook. He very much brings sanity to all the people saying, you do X, Y, or Z, you become a fascist. And obviously Sandbrook here is saying, no, not really. But he is saying if you are going to get anyone to do that, it's going to have to be the two main parties. Why? Oh, because reform will be fairly useless. As if we've not witnessed decades upon decades, three at the, this example, of being completely useless. In some ways, being completely useless and knowing what you're doing is worse than being completely useless and not knowing what you're doing. This is part of the reason Labour are basically panicking because Ed Miliband's the energy secretary with the net zero lot. Because he knows what he's doing and he's making energy prices worse. Anyway, Edwina goes into a bit of a rant going point by point into why people are fed up with immigration, hospital lines being really long, struggling to get kids into schools, hell, even trying to get into the swimming pools has been an issue for some people because there's so many migrants here. And they end up concluding with this segment with this.
And Keir Starmer has clearly previously thought it was too unpalatable, and still now I think believes it's too unpalatable to make those points. And if we look at Keir Starmer's previous career, a human rights lawyer, director of public prosecutions, he may find himself, if he goes down this road, arguing against cases he's made in the past.
Yes, that's right. But it's better that he does it. I mean, I say this as a Tory. I think it is better if people with a good heart and a good knowledge do this, make this pivot, than leave it to people who Dominic has rightly just described as a bunch of people who really won't know what they're doing, but they'll do this.
Yeah, it's interesting. The Liberal revolt has started on Times where a Liberal pivot of Dominic Sandbrook and Edwina Currie has begun at 9 o'clock this morning on August the 20th.
They are all in agreement. Keep reform out. Why? Because even though Keir Starmer has helped bring about this issue and it's been terrible, it's better for him because he has knowledge of this entire system to actually keep it in place rather than get Reforming, who have made it quite clear they're going to do a big old repeal act, they're going to make sure we get rid of the Human Rights Act and the ECHR, or at least amend them radically, to make sure that the way British politics is done and the way government works will look completely different to what we are used to. A lot of boomers, and I do have a lot of apology for the boomers, I think they're overblamed for a lot of this, but especially those in this bubble are very adverse to change. Why is that? Because they're at the top of the ladder, they're at the top of the greasy pole, and being up there, you have chaos making its way up, all of a sudden you lose that position. This is why a lot of people don't want reform there, because they know that they aren't going to stay there. That is why. Reform are literally a threat to these people. And as much as people try and say this is just reform climbing the greasy pole, sorry, this is daily. This is a daily occurrence on Times Radio. I listen to these people. All these people trying to tell you that Reform are part of the establishment, Farage is part of the establishment, I don't know what more proof I need. Go on Times Radio yourself. Keep listening to everything they have when it comes to covering Farage, these major issues that they're bringing up, what Nigel Farage's plans are. They're against him. They don't trust him. And that should imply that maybe he's trustworthy to the people who are against those that don't trust Farage. Maybe he's not an inside man. Maybe, just maybe, he is going to bring about the political earthquake we have all been waiting for. Hell, we're right in the middle of it. I'm sorry, but this has been mentioned by a friend of the channel, Lauchai Larry, over on Twitter, but seriously, a year ago, just over a year ago really, if you told me that Reform would be 30-odd% in the polls, 15 points ahead of Labour, 16 points ahead of the Tories, everyone's panicking, everyone's now trying to throw out and create policies to give them right-wing credentials and try and outflank Reform and Farage on everything that's going on in politics, you'd think we'd died and gone to heaven. You look at the online right, though, for months they've been trying to undermine Reform, along with, all the mainstream is trying to undermine Reform, and it's still happening. I've had some very nice DMs and people saying that basically Haryan was right with the Low thing, Haryan was right about a whole bunch of people who are in the periphery of the Tory party are obviously not willing to move over to Reform, want to keep the Tory party going, that betrayed us every step of the way over the last 14 years, if you go from 2024 obviously. And it's obviously stroked my ego to some degree, and made me feel very good about the positions that I have been holding out on. But let's just be real here. You can't just start ignoring the media just because Reform are winning in the polls and winning a whole load of elections. We're still on step one of this revolution, or counter-revolution if you want to put it that way. We're on step one of it. You know, we've got a load of councils, that's great, they're doing quite well, they're running into a lot of issues, sure. That's to be expected from what is effectively trying to run a freight train at full speed while building a battering ram on the front. Obviously you're going to have problems with that, obviously there's going to be some panic. And yet, what seems to happen? Everyone's just started ignoring the mainstream on the online right, and they are now, because all they know how to do is be negative, they're looking for every reason to hate on Reform, because effectively that's how they build their channels, that's how they get their popularity. And now, look, Tories are the underdogs. Like, let's carry water for them all the time. It's getting ridiculous. And when we actually listen to what Tory supporters and ex-Tory ministers, ex-minister Tories, actually have to say, it's, my God, we are panicking about Reform, we hate it, we need to give them some red meat and try and undermine them with that. Because don't you understand, you need us in charge yet again. As if this wasn't a chance that they were given time and time again over the last 15 years. It's over. And everyone's mind should be on that. You can have your problems with Reform, I know I do, but let's be real, I have way bigger problems with the existing and still pumping uniparty and elite circles that are very much trying to defend themselves and keep Reform out than I do with Reform themselves. That's why they get an awful lot of leeway from me. Because at the end of the day, Farage has basically not changed his opinions in 20 years, which I am fine with. But he is being very realistic about what he can actually implement. And that shows me someone who is very much expecting to get into government and is taking it seriously. So I say, why not give him a chance? Clearly, the people that we all don't like and have betrayed us politically don't want that. Well, at the very least, let's stick two fingers up at them once again. Anyway, I think I've covered everything I want to today, so Shill time. Tonight I'll be playing some Hollow Knight. Saturday there will be some Laughing at the Guardian with some Warman. Videos out as and when I can make them. When it comes to helping out the channel, do subscribe, do leave a like, do leave a comment too. Great ways to help out the channel. If you'd like to help out more, you can become a member, leave a super chat or super thanks in any stream or video that I do as well. Right, with that, that's everything I had for you for today. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.